I had come through, I think, quite a series of burnouts
Mm.
and like difficult and challenging environments. And we've been through a series of restructures. I think they can kind of, go, this is work, this, whatever. I'll do what I need to do and I'll get on. And I can do that to a certain extent, but I think over time that really grinds me down. And if we continually make decisions that I feel don't have clear values other than maintaining money, then I really struggle with that. And
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Fiona, it's really nice to reconnect with you. And I was just thinking like how doing this podcast has enabled me to sort of have an excuse to talk to people that, I had some experience with and some kind of interaction with. And you were one of the people that I kind of remembered and thought, oh, yeah, an interesting person to talk to. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming.
so it's nice because occasionally I'll see you pop up and it's nice to reconnect. So I'm glad we get the opportunity to connect again.
Yeah, and I mean this podcast, like I kind of made it in response to what felt like a kind of AI-ifying space and lots of sort
Mm.
of, truth bombs on LinkedIn and this kind of stuff. And I was just sort of like, my experience of reality is that people don't talk like that, and actually people
Mm.
are people. And so I wanted to bring out human conversations. And that was really, where it all started. It's just to sort of bring some humanness back into this. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to. I usually start this, and I guess for some people that won't know you, like I wonder if you could perhaps give them some orientation about like who is this chap that Danny's talking to, and what relevance
Yeah.
does he has to design, and perhaps you can give people a little bit of an orientation.
Yeah. Okay. So I am a partner at a small studio called Andthen. We are a design futures consultancy, really looking at, I guess, how you apply design to longer term questions and to, I guess, widening the breadth of people that are able to engage meaningfully in thinking about the future and influencing large decisions about the future, whether that's policy or strategy or organizational change. So I guess at times quite an intangible space for design. Like we're not designing products, although we can, and that like there's kind of like bits and pieces within this that you do end up designing quite physical things. I'm just looking around my desk for some 3D printed models that we've been doing that feel
Yeah.
really connected to my my original design practice, but you're at the same time exploring things that are maybe quite ethereal. Um, so yeah, we're a 3-person studio. We're a partner-based studio, so each of us are part owners of the company, all quite experienced, capable of leading projects, managing projects and contracts, and kind of leading in that way. And that was the kind of ambition in this reimagination of this studio that had existed in the past, but in a slightly different guise. But before that, I led a large consulting team or a human-centered design practice or user-centered design practice at a large consulting firm.
which is
And prior
where
to
which is where
that,
we met, wasn't it? That's where
which is
our
where we
paths
met,
crossed.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And before that, worked in a large bank initially as a kind of individual contributor, to use that term, then in a kind of establishing a creative team within an innovation department in that bank.
And
And that's kind of probably
well, I
yeah,
did a bit
sorry.
of nosying on your LinkedIn, and I have to do some homework, and I saw like you started. It's interesting. You said artist in residence at Edinburgh College of Art, and
Yeah.
I think you were sort of exploring like pure creative exploration and tactile artistic practice. I think is what I saw something around that. I'd love to know more.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, like I can give you a longer history,
Yeah.
of like entry into design and,
Yeah, like how did you become
um,
a designer? Like how
yeah.
what was
So
your
like
journey?
it has, my journey has been slightly meandering, but always really connected to design. I think through my life, I've always enjoyed some of the practical elements of things. I enjoyed both practical elements, but also like quite conceptual things. And I just always remember my dad making me do things like, paint, do DIY. I remember I wanted a new bed, build my own bed, maybe build my own wardrobe that like just stood half built for so long throughout my life. So I think that I had this natural inclination towards like making and probably a slight personality bent around independence and things like this that it can push me into a space where creativity was actually like practical creativity was moving. So I went first and I studied furniture design and manufacture at a craft
Oh,
cottage on the west coast of Ireland. Um, and really like engaged with that kind of crafting space, but kind of felt a little bit limited in the the centricity of ego in those spaces. And like, a kind of an eventual path out of that would be to be this kind of celebrity designer maker where,
oh.
sell tables for like £10,000.
So the fact that so and so made it is the significance rather than the
The,
quality
the,
or
f-
creative,
exactly.
the brand that sells it.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just felt very disconnected to where I was. I wasn't confident enough in my own design decisions as like in a purely aesthetic form. Like I didn't have a conceptual frame for those design decisions at that time. So
And this
it
is
didn't feel
furniture, like
appealing.
making
Yeah. Like
chairs,
making
beds, or what have
chairs.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But if you think about, I guess a lot of that inspiration was like heavily modernist kind of inspiration. So I guess like any of those kind of classical modernist um, architects, from Mies van der Rohe to Charles Emery Eames, like all of that kind of was a very strong influence in that space where it was very dedicated to form. And I think I was drawn to some of the conceptual ideas, in modernism of like this kind of pared back, exposing the reality of what's there, not hiding away from the materials. Um, but that was the real connection was in form, and so you were kind of exploring form, and then there was a huge element of craft within that as well, which is really about like how good are your joints,
Yeah.
how tight can you get that dovetail joint, is there a 0.2 of a millimeter or 0.1 of a millimeter margin of error, and I just the level of concentration and dedication I didn't have at that time, but I when I was 21, I was in my no, I was 20. Oh, jeez, no, 21. Can't remember. There's one point. All right, I really just I had a bit of an experience separately that made me just kind of reflect on where I was going, and I stopped drinking and I stopped smoking weed, and stopped doing anything like that, and I was kind of refocusing my life. And I kind of felt like, oh, like, there's lots of opportunity outside of this. I really enjoy some of the conceptual stuff. Maybe I need to broaden my kind of scale of what design is. And so I came to Edinburgh. I did the study in the College of Art. It came at a point when we had a really interesting head of design, a guy called Andy Law, who really encouraged this curiosity I felt in me about like what design could be, and kind of flipped it around from this kind of, I guess, space where design was I guess, finite thing where you would design this thing and it would be finished, to this kind of dialogue uh, of interaction between you and someone, and where you were always constantly curious about how someone would respond to this thing that you put out in the world. And actually where that was a lot of the excitement and passion would come in.
And this is not making furniture per se. This is, we're talking about the form of creativity and design in its raw essence. Like the medium is, we're not even
Yeah,
thinking about the
whatever.
medium at this point. Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
wow.
you're thinking about like methods and thinking about like, I remember some of the first things that we did was we used cultural probes quite early, which I don't know if you've come across cultural probes, but like basically you design an artifact or a series of tasks that can be relatively obscure. And so maybe like often they include like a disposable camera, and you might ask people to take a picture of, the spiritual center of their home, or something like that. Something quite abstract
Wow.
and kind of ambiguous. And then you take a lot of that information to help you kind of design. So you might be probing into a particular topic or area, but with kind of like quite open questions in a way that might drive a different type of reaction and response and different inspiration. But even
Wow.
that, even to design these things and do these things, we first put all these art ornaments around Edinburgh, and we attached a number, a Skype number to them. And people called, and we had like a question. I can't remember what it was. It was like about something about like a customer service experience you've had that was really meaningful, or I can't remember. Like, we're really crap. And we got people to call this number and leave these messages. And I was just like blown away by this like crazy like process of going out into the street, like putting these random objects around the street, and then like getting a phone call from
Yeah.
somebody that we've no idea who they are. And they would just go on this kind of meandering. And it was just such an interesting, and then that was the design material. That was like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
and I was like, whoa, what? This is so different to like me thinking about like, I don't know, like what materials I'm going to use, what finishes I'm going to use, how I'm going to construct
Yeah.
this
This
table
is
or
this. You're
chair.
interfering with the world. You're
Yeah,
disrupting people as they are, in their thoughts and in their routines, and then they see this invitation to make a phone call, and like you're kind of, yeah, you're really having an effect of sort of throwing a stone into the pond kind of thing.
completely. And that was a real inspiration for me to imagine design in a different space where design is not just about like production, but is about engagement. It's about facilitation. It's about participation. It's about all of these different elements that would come together. So that was kind of into Edinburgh College of Art, and I did my degree there, and that was kind of really core foundational skills of, I guess, human centered design practice, of research, prototyping, iteration,
Yeah.
um,
This is like a
and
really solid design foundation. Like I feel sort of slightly humbled in a sense. I've never felt my practice was particularly grounded in something so rich. Like, this is a really rich beginning in design. You're talking like proper
you know,
art and craft, and you're not really being consumed by the medium, but more like the actual essence of what's possible with design. Like, I feel like I'm
yeah,
I'm interviewing a proper designer.
I don't know. I think at that age, I think, in my first degree, I really wasn't. You're straight out of school.
Yeah,
You're there for a good time sometimes, not always there for
yeah,
the right reasons.
yeah.
And I think it was only really when I came to Edinburgh that really, there was a spark. I saw that degree as work nearly. And I mean, first year was a bit of a shift because I had moved from a directed course to a self-directed course, and having to kind of orient and be like, oh no, this is my stuff. I need to now generate a passion and a curiosity around. But by the end of that, I was really invested. I was like,
Yeah, yeah.
I would have just done that. To be honest, still would just do it because it's become now so entwined with my identity that I can't not do it.
Well, yeah, because
Uh,
there's a sort
yeah,
of spirit that I hear, like a kind of free spirit of like being curious and enjoying provoking the world and being creative. And I'm sort of, there's part of me thinking, oh God, how does this young person then interact with kind of, getting into corporate realities of like,
yeah, yeah,
the okay, so we're a big organization. We need to monetize this person's skill, like,
yeah,
because you at
yeah,
some point you're coming out of that university and you're getting into sort of entrepreneurship. But then I'm noticing, just looking at your LinkedIn, there's more sort of like NatWest and kind of banking and things like that. What starts to happen to that person that have that inspiration, and then they're getting into
mm.
these more controlled and narrow spaces? Like, what starts to happen at that point, do you think?
I think reality hits a little bit. when I started to move out of academia, so I had done, after my degree, so this is 2 degrees in now. I'm like 6 years into undergrad.
Yeah, nice.
I did my arts residence. I was like, hustling on the side, like just working side jobs and stuff. Um, and then in the last year of my degree, I got married. Um, so I was quite young getting married. I was 24,
Yeah, yeah,
but it gave us like a kind of stable kind of space. But we were about to have a child as I finished up my master's, and I needed to start working
yeah,
in a job that paid more than kind of the freelance stuff. I was kind of involved in, as I'd done my master's, I started to get involved in like academic research projects, which was fascinating and I loved, but was really unstructured, and I couldn't see myself doing a PhD at that time. I couldn't see myself doing another 6 years on the stipend. Um, and so, yeah, and we had a relationship with an innovation department in a bank. And so I was knocking on lots of doors at that time to look for an entry. And that was a huge learning curve, a massive learning curve. I often talk about going into that space is like, your currency in those previous spaces was like questions and novelty.
yeah,
What, what's it? Oh, that's an interesting direction. That's an
yeah.
interesting question to ask. What's an interesting perspective to have? And in the bank, it was the opposite. You do
Too
not
many
want to
questions.
have questions. Just answers. Just have answers. Always answers.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of a learning curve to step away from that and kind of
So
go, all
your
right, yeah.
commodity, your value is measured in how many questions you have, and then now it's valued in how many answers you have. And
And how
that's not
confident you
necessarily
are.
whether the answers are right. It's presumably how confidently you can express them.
And yeah, it's not how good the answers are, just how much risk does it take away from the organization or from
Yeah.
somebody.
Wow. And that was I think you're like a creative lead there. So that's sort of,
Yeah, I started like at the time it was called the Technology Solution Center. So I kind of saw like, oh, this is kind of like Google X, but for the banking sector. Maybe my reality of that was maybe a little bit less lofty than like a Google X, because at the time this was like 2015 when I joined the bank. We're still quite techno-optimists in our ways. We were all kind of like, oh yeah,
we were
data,
still the
big
good guys.
data, AI. Yeah, it was still the good guys. And it was still, there was like those, you knew that, I don't know, what's that? I don't know if you remember any of these projects from Google X. They had like Project Loon, which is like, oh, can we, create these weather balloons that go around the Earth, that circulate the Earth in a low
Yeah.
orbit
I remember that. Yeah.
and provide data, and kind of
We're
data
digitizing
infrastructure.
the world. It's a
Yeah, and it's
freedom. It's
like,
information. Information sets people free.
yeah, and you can kind of see through that a little bit, but you're kind of like, oh, but it's still, I get that there's like a Western perspective through that, but it's not like fully evil at that point. Um, and so I was like, oh yeah, the bank, man, you could do this shit. Banking is like, you know, everybody has to bank. Everybody has to
Yeah.
use money. If you can like work in the space, it's a really fascinating space. But it just became actually, you just get so caught into delivery, and you realize yeah, essential that was. And yeah, you're right. I was in a space that was like, so we were technology solution center, which was very tech centric, but employing design thinking approaches to kind of challenges and trying to use emerging technology. And we were
Mm-hmm.
part of a broader space that would scout for new startups, but also look at like emerging technology trends. Um, and then we moved into a space and had real prominence in the bank. We had like what was the old executive wing in Goulburn, huge investment into the space. And we were, yeah, taking on like quite high priority initiatives, although like
Yeah.
maybe like not completely aligned to like, we weren't going to do something that was like a commercial priority, but we were going to do something that might have a commercial impact in 5 to 10 years, that kind
Yeah.
of
And so you're
stuff.
doing like moonshots and stuff.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. but you were still very much caught in the culture of the corporate.
The corporate
And
space. I mean, it was a different. I really feel like it's. I feel like such an oldie, but it just feels like just listening to you say about you're working in this bank and they're basically letting you work on stuff where they're not expecting an ROI for 4 or 5 years time, and I'm
yeah,
just thinking like how that that kind of cult. It doesn't feel like that's the culture at the moment. I'm
yeah,
thinking of like the analogy I use is like how when I was working, like it feels like there was just a lot more abundance and a lot more adversity to risk, and less adversity. Like how when I was back in teams in mid 2000s, and it was sort of like, we'd take 3 days out for a team do, and they
really,
they they send us abroad. Yeah, I've been to like
yeah,
Cuba and went around like Europe and stuff
wow,
for team dues. And it's just that sort of sense of like, and I remember like working on a project and then them going after like 3 months and going, oh yeah, I don't think we're going to use it actually, but like there's no like worry about the money spent and stuff like that. And
really,
the world that I'm in, that I'm seeing now in corporate spaces is like that doesn't wash. There's no team do for 3 days. There's no moonshot work. Not that I'm the set streams I'm in. It's all quite like they want to see an ROI really quickly, and there's this
yeah,
expectation that the design is expensive and can be kind of cut back, and there isn't this
yeah,
sense of like experimentation and
mm,
this dream like we can do anything. It's like no, we need to reduce costs, we need to automate,
yeah,
we need to
yeah,
kind of narrow down. It doesn't feel like there's that divergency of weather balloons mapping the world. I don't feel like we're in that space somehow. I don't know.
yeah.
Does that ring for you?
Yeah, like it's interesting because I think our current work is quite open and really early, but it is it's hard to get huge buy-in to that at times, and um
You
we
mean
end
that
up
with the
working with
agency
very
you're with
specific.
now?
Yeah, exactly. Because the industry we are with now is very much about like what is the vision for the future? What is the thing that
Right.
you really are working towards? And then let's experiment with that and let's keep that quite open and let's do something quite playful to help us get there. But then let's really ground it. Let's ground it in practical action. Let's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
make this lofty and unachievable. But even that, like we often say like a strong vision makes 1,000 other decisions, and I think it speeds up so many things. But people are it's hard to find always the right types of that's not it's I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not an open field for who we speak to with we're not engaging in design delivery spaces. We're engaging in third sector universities,
Yeah. Yeah.
policy spaces rather than that that space where I guess design has really flourished in the last you think about the last 15 years.
Yeah.
Design has
Okay.
really been in that design delivery and bringing stronger design methods. And I know the last couple of years have been particularly hard, but
Because
yeah,
you did quite a pivot uh, from sort of working in like banking and then that global consultancy and then to this andthen.org. I There was something that I was one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you particularly was I just noticed you said something about how it was quite, I'm imagining it's quite a pivot to kind of go from quite a kind of senior role at a recognized consultancy and leave that and then go into something that's a little less stable, presumably less pay and a bit more like unstable maybe, and not as much certainty as a sort of steady, reliable salary and stuff. And that is kind of, and there's quite a lot of courage to kind of leave something like that. I would think. But how was that for you? Like, was it
yeah.
an easy decision to change direction?
It was, you know, that that the last role really I had come through. I think quite a series of burnouts,
Mm,
and like difficult and challenging environments, and we've been through a series of restructures, which I think because like I think lots of people weather those things really well.
yeah.
I think they can kind of, go, this is work, this, whatever. somebody else's decision about what they do. I will do within my role. I'll do what I need to do, and I'll get on. And I can do that to a certain extent, but I think over time that really grinds me down. And if we continually make decisions that I feel are don't have clear values other than maintaining money, then I really struggle with that. And so I guess you know, when you say it's courageous, I sometimes think it's a bit selfish, and that I've gone into this space where, yeah, we are probably more precarious. It's definitely more precarious from a salary perspective.
It's a different
Income is
kind of
not.
stress, though, isn't it? Like,
Yeah, it's
I
a
guess
different
there's a
stress.
stress
Yeah,
of that tension of your own values and your own sense of meaning versus a tension of uncertainty and lack of you know full confidence that you know what the future is going to hold. Something that we talk about on this podcast a lot, is like mental health and challenges that people have in this sector. Because being a designer, like it's a bit of a head fuck,
yeah,
like doing
yeah,
it, especially in corporate spaces. And I was just curious, and as much as you feel that you want to share, like what did that? You said you had like multiple burnouts. Like what did that look like? Like how did that kind of manifest itself for you? How did you know? And I can share too. I also have
yeah,
had
yeah.
experiences like that.
Yeah. So I guess like maybe like some of the context. Remember, Danny, like maybe if we talk about like when you were in, right? When you worked on a couple of different things with us. And we were bidding for a large piece of work around a prison service and probation.
Yeah, I remember that.
Um, which was quite like, I don't know, sometimes I think, fucking hell, this is some weird stuff to be working on, when you have maybe some conflicting views on how this works, and conflicting views on incarceration and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
but
Yeah.
but then you're like, oh, this could be also like the bank thing. This could be a huge opportunity. When we were talking about like how do you engage and bring lived experience into these conversations where you're
Yeah.
discussing probationary periods, and like that feels like a real opportunity. But so often I think you get kind of burned by trying to have those strong values in there, trying to bring in something that will affect change,
Yeah.
and then it getting ripped out at the end because
Yeah,
somebody's really just using it as a means of selling.
I
Sorry,
can
go on.
remember. I think I can remember what you're talking about because I can remember, and we can keep it abstract enough, but I think it's okay to say. But it's like we were talking about like making this vision. I remember writing this vision about working with the prison service and creating like a system and where we would be able to involve prisoners and probation officers, and we would all um, kind of convene as an equal party to be able to understand each other in order to be able to improve the experience of not just prisoners, but probation officers and judges, but kind of create this space where we were all um, removing the power dynamic and really like listening to each other. And I remember kind of like cultivating that kind of vision and getting some nods and stuff like that. But obviously I was only there for a few months and stuff. But it's that kind of there was a there was a goodness in there, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
imagining what probably happened is it all got gutted and it's just sort of we just need to kind of deliver this and forget all that nonsense.
Yeah, yeah. People don't really connect with it, and so often I'll pass that off as like, oh, they haven't experienced it. But I think realistically, it just wasn't people's priority. Uh, and people can be very astute when a lot of things come down to it. The money is such a big element to all of this that they'll be looking at this going, well, somebody else is going to undercut this, and we need to be competitive on price. And this is a nice to have, not a core element. And so I think that mindset, um, it gets, that was some of the stuff. So, there was a time, when I'd come in as a lead service designer, but really as a kind of, I had actually stepped away from management in that West to kind of be in a slightly more kind of senior individual contributor type role, wanting
Mm.
to do that. And then we'd had multiple heads of design leave. So I was like, all right, I'll just I'll put my hand up. I have some thoughts about how we should go and where we should go. Uh, And yeah, was fortunate enough to be successful in that. And um, we've had a big contract with a large government body, and that created a huge demand, and we grew really quickly. We grew from like 20 to like 50
Yeah.
people in like the space of a year. Um, um, but with that growth, you don't, like with anything, you don't see immediate returns on that. And I think the business financially was very risk averse, so I felt in a really hard position where the budget was set and the aspirational budget was set, and like things like our profit margin and our gross margin were set, targets around that, and we weren't fulfilling them. But I'd no ability to influence like our sales process hugely. Like, I could go and I could respond to bids, and I could go out and do sales myself and like, build relationships. But, you're part of a much wider ecosystem, and it's very hard to shift that dial solely.
But yeah, you're sort of on the hook for it, even though you can't
You're on the
like
hook.
massively influence it. Like all you can do is sort of kind of, tuck in the sides and do a little bit here and there, but you can't like make a kind of radical decision of like, we're going to target this type of user, this type of customer,
Yeah.
and we're going to pivot our brand. You can't do anything like that.
Can't pivot, can't change a customer type. I could do a lot of, I guess what I could have done was really focus on things that would have had really short-term gains, but
Yeah.
would have distracted me from longer-term things.
Yeah.
So I guess I was trying to position our practice as really robust and aligned with, we were facing into government. So how can we kind of build practice in the way that government builds practice? Government has a huge and really credible design practice. How can we like mimic that and also, instill those values across the business?
Mm,
Then um, we're not a threat to the government. Then we're like a really
yeah.
strong collaborator and partner.
Yeah.
So I think what I would have seen me do is put my team in really difficult positions on like short-term projects where they're probably not delivering a lot of value. They don't have a lot of
Yeah.
choice, and a lot of agency, and they're probably not delivering very good work. And
No.
that didn't was just not. I like, to be honest, it's not even a thing that comes into my not. And I don't mean this in a like, oh, I just couldn't even fathom doing that. No, it just wasn't like I just don't see that. I wasn't seeing those things as opportunities. I was looking at the other things that I thought, oh, there's an opportunity. I'll invest time there. That other stuff just didn't really come into my focus too much, and
Yeah.
which, tactically was maybe not always a good decision.
And does all of that picture that you describe, like that just creates stress, I suppose,
Yeah, hugely.
and a sense of like weight and a sense of anxiety and like maybe some like identity as well. Like that, I feel that's quite common, you know. And I think, for myself, like sometimes I think of I do think of my value. It's hard to say, but my value does get intertwined with how well I'm doing at work. Like if I'm doing really well
Yeah,
at work on the weekend, I kind of feel like a bit of a bounce. Like, yeah, I did some really
yeah,
cool stuff. And then if work's like tanking, then I find it hard to necessarily always like feel good about myself. And I think
yeah,
for designers especially, because you kind of, even if it's in a corporate space, you're still putting your heart into it. There's heart. Like it doesn't. It's not this
yeah,
like cold corporate drumbeat. There's some heart in there of like, I've seen something that could be created that could throw that rock into that pond, and I'm getting
yeah,
excited, and now it's getting crushed.
yeah. It's it is,
Is that? I
yeah.
mean,
It's like
is that
those
kind of touch some of
it's,
the beats that
yeah.
you're
So it's
experiencing?
like that, those memes of that those pressure things crushing all sorts of different
Yeah,
objects.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Like, oh, here's another idea that's crushed into powder.
But I mean, given that, like, was it not a hard decision to leave that corporate space then? Like, given that kind of environment?
So yeah, it was less hard, and because we'd been through quite a few stages where actually, you know, in the end, I took voluntary redundancy, but I was delighted to take voluntary redundancy.
Really?
I
Yeah,
was
it's a
like
gift.
I was like, oh, I am so happy to be made or to be
Yeah,
like had the chance to take redundancy, because we just for about a year I'd been really hanging on because we
yeah,
needed financial stability as a home.
yeah.
Um,
You got stuff at home that you got to
yeah,
hang
you've
in there for.
kids, and like a
Oh,
compounding factor in all of this was that we were running a um a renovation at the same time that was absolutely failing, and we'd been made homeless at one point and had to move back to Ireland. Like there was like huge complications in the background that were just compounding it. And I think it was, there's a certain amount of time where you can um, do things and accept that the conditions aren't correct. And then when you're out and the conditions are correct, like, I think in that first year, I was like, the conditions aren't correct, but, we're moving. And next year, as the budget comes in, I can say that the budget needs to shift in a
yeah.
particular
I've
direction.
got to hang
And I
in.
think, and when that wasn't accepted and logic was not like, there wasn't or wasn't, I guess, it just wasn't met with like real kind of understanding or ability to discuss. It was
Yeah,
like, no, this is the way the system works, and you're gonna have to make it work again. I was just like, this is just ridiculous. I'm just now really struggling. And so I did that for a while. Yeah, and then we'd had some restructures that really caused some fractures within relationships that were really difficult.
yeah,
Where people who were very close, and who I had a lot of strong relationships, where those relationships broke down, and I couldn't always see what was happening, and that was quite difficult to maintain, because I think sometimes we end up in the space where corporates kind of depersonalize human relationships,
yeah.
and they're like,
Becomes
oh, it's just
transactional.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's just work. And it's like, it's not. Like, there's so much, like you say, there's so much heart in some of these things that there's a lot of times when you're putting in heart in that space, and I find it very hard to detach some of those. So I think,
yeah,
once those things start to degrade, it was just really difficult to hang in there. And I still have really lots of great relationships with people, but um, yeah, it was a difficult thing. So then this became an opportunity, and it was something I was actually really disillusioned with design by the end of my time
yeah,
at that
yeah,
consultancy. And um, just thinking that, like, this is kind of, we're just repeating the same stuff. I'm still advocating for the point of engaging a user, but what the hell is this? This is like basic stuff. We're talking about the bare bones of design. We're not even talking about the really interesting stuff.
yeah.
Get purchased for that. Like, what, where do we go from here? So, yeah, and then was a gift, really, rather than a hugely courageous step. I guess.
And so, yeah, from that you then shifted into and then org, which is where you are now. So what like this is quite different. This is like turning design maybe back into what you originally kind of is heart of like being much more ethereal and like open to that. We're not just talking about digital products. You could be talking about kind of visions, concepts, policies, maybe real world objects. It's quite broad, right? Is that right?
Yeah, completely. And I think that's always where I've tried to push design, or I think I've just naturally been drawn to that. Um, and I don't know what it is. If it's just a discomfort at times. I think, when you get, maybe it's like I don't know, from a frustration with a set of constraints. But I think at times, when you're like pushed into those positions where you've been told to deliver this thing and you just know it's bad.
Yeah.
You're just like, oh, this is fucking shit.
JFDIs. Yeah.
Like, yeah, just fucking do it. And you're just like, okay. I think throughout my career, I've just been like, okay, how do I get back to that conversation? So I can like have a conversation at that point. And then so I think this does two things. Like, I think it does absolutely take it back to where my initial seeds were and where I was really interested, which was how can design be exploratory and open and help people to reframe something, or um, reimagine what something could be.
Mm.
Um, and how can it still use creative practice to do that, but like maybe tackling some topics that are really strong. Um, and also then doing and leaning on some of the things that I've picked up along the way around I guess, managerial influencing, being able to be clear about strategic benefit and strategic decisions and
Yeah,
investments
yeah,
and
yeah.
kind of practical applications and actions. Um, so yeah, I think it's a really strong marriage of those two things. Um, like, would it be helpful to talk about like the type of stuff that we do? Like,
Yeah, well, I'm curious.
what's
Yeah,
useful?
there was a few things I was thinking is interesting. What one would be help. It was interesting to know what you guys do, but also I noticed you do like pro bono work, and you've done some pro bono work, which really speaks to a certain like value that I was kind of yeah. Like I mean, I've done a bit of work in that sector, and that's the kind
Yeah,
of stuff that I've seen happen in that sector. But for some people, that would be like, wait, what? So yeah, maybe it'd be interesting just to share a little bit about what the mission is, and then yeah, I'd be curious like the values and how different it feels to be a designer in this new culture.
yeah. Um, so I should have done some research before, so I'm like getting myself together before. But we've got a quite a nice distinct vision, which I think is um like advocating for a place or helping everybody make better long-term decisions or something like that. I can't remember exactly the phrasing, but really about like how can you embed long-term decision making in in a much broader group of people, and also change the behaviors that people are not just making these quick short-term, you know, like the transactional kind of decisions we've been talking about earlier. Where's that ROI on that? Let's A/B test that. Let's, which are important things in a delivery, but sometimes then can be applied into a strategic space, and we just kind of snowball into a direction that we don't even know anymore. So how can
Yeah,
you help people step back and think longer about those decisions?
unhurried, I think, was one of the words I picked up from looking at some of the stuff. But yeah, I guess that would make sense why you would have experience with that, having been inside such a big corporate machine that has sort of probably become quite disconnected from any kind of vision and is now probably just churning out project after project and is looking at the top line, and then that starts to make things all about quick decisions. And that sort of, if you think of the nervous system of the culture, it's a
Yeah,
bit jaggedy and it's a bit anxious, and it's that kind of thing when you're
yeah,
stressed and someone else needs to make a
yeah,
decision, and it's almost like culturally that's kind of where that organization was. And it sounds like, having experienced that, what not to do,
yeah,
you're
yeah,
you're able to kind of imbue a slightly different, and invite a different way of being, which I think, eh, that sense of like slow decisions, it's something I've been saying to my wife about when we do renovations on the house. Sometimes I'm like, let's just make a slow decision. So let's just talk about it for a few
yeah,
weeks or months,
yeah,
and we don't have to
yeah.
do that thing on the house like next
Right
week.
now,
Like, well, let's do a slow decision. And something that
yeah,
feels right about doing that, and I think we've probably lost that as in this age, and I kind of, I'm
mm.
imagining that in like indigenous cultures and stuff, that they ain't doing this crazy decision making like we do. They'll talk about
No,
something and then make a decision next year.
yeah, and I think there's like there is a sense of, right, like there's definitely things that you have to make decisions on every day, right?
Yeah.
You have to. There's those. I don't know. That. Have you ever seen that pace layers? That diagram that has like different pace layers. I can't remember. I think. Oh my god, what's his name? He's a Hawaiian futurist, and I'm pretty sure it's that guy who did it. But basically, there's like
I'll
different
bring it
layers
up.
of
I'll bring it up
change.
later. Yeah.
So there's layers of. I can send you the diagram afterwards. So you've got like, you know, fashion trends, or super quick, like they just change all the time, nearly on a daily
Yeah.
basis.
Fast
and
fashion,
then you've
all that. Yeah.
and then you've got like different layers underneath, like I don't know. um, uh, so I'm gonna, I'm gonna bring it up because I have to think at
We're on
this,
the
but
internet.
basically,
This is possible.
yeah, come on, come on. um so
So
at the top
for
you've
those
got like
on an audio podcast, we're looking at um, rings. Like it says pace
concentric
layering.
circles. Yeah.
Yeah, like a ring of fashion, commerce, infrastructure, governance, culture, nature, and it's sort of building inward down to nature. Is that how you
Yeah,
interpret?
exactly. Yeah. And so the fashion at the top layer, the outmost outer layer of these series of concentric circles is really fast and squiggly. Commerce is also quite fast, but less squiggly. Infrastructure is a bit slower. Governance is a bit slower again.
I see.
Culture, then much slower. And nature, much like, very crawling, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and now I'm trying to remember.
Well,
This
I
was in
suppose
relation
that it
to,
sounded like that's the sort of invitation that you have with your clients
oh,
in your
yes.
job is
Yeah,
to get them
yes.
into that slow thinking, that like nature as opposed to fast fashion. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess there's different decisions that have to happen on a different basis, right? On an everyday basis, you might need to make a decision about what you're doing for dinner, and you might not have food in the fridge. So you got to go to the shop and you got to make a choice, and you might be feeling like
Yeah.
you want something else other than
Yeah.
what's there. And so you're making these fast decisions. But I think what happens is when you make those fast decisions about things that are much longer term, that's when you start to get real disjunctures and you lose a sense of where you're going. And I think like take it back to those, um, we're speaking here, like I'm speaking without real context of any of what indigenous cultures might be about this, but like where I think there's lots of values that are encoded in longer cultures and cultures that we might consider indigenous and there's lots of knowledge that's encoded in those ways, whether that's the Aboriginal, have those song walks or they do these walks that kind of mimic the land, and they know their paths and they know how the land works because of how the story that's been embedded in their culture.
Wow.
um um and so those things aren't changed. They aren't changing those big things, right? They're not saying like, oh, we should shift where these trees are now, because they're thinking in this
There's more
long kind of
constant.
context.
There's more
Yeah, and
constant.
it's
So they're not
whereas
having to
now,
change the big pillars of their reality. There's big pillars of reality staying constant and grounding, and they're the same. And then you're only having to make smaller, less stressful decisions around that.
yeah,
That's how I interpret that.
and also like there's also like a different relationship with those longer term things, right? Like the longer term thing, there is a sense of long term in that. There's a sense of history and a sense of trajectory. There's probably like a connection with a wider society, um, and and a set of values that start to be encoded in those stories that help you to think about the long term. And I think what happens is now we just get caught in the short term, and the only long term value is money. Like I think a lot of that, like a lot of the framing around long term decision making is just like, is it a good investment decision? What will the return be now or in the future? Um, and rarely are we thinking about like, this is not completely like, I know that we are thinking about things like ecology and climate, but we're not thinking about that fast enough, or like in a thinking about that in a way that is um um central to all our decision making. That's like a distant piece that we occasionally dip into, probably in a way that because we think it will help us build reputation and build money. So it just sort of like this kind of line that comes underneath.
Do you think? Do
And
you think
so
you've?
yeah.
Do you think? I mean, that I really appreciate that perspective, and it makes me reflect. And I was just thinking of this younger designer that started out, and do you feel like, given that journey that you described, and given the kind of culture and ways of thinking, ways of creating that you're doing now, do you feel like you found your home for the time being? Do you feel like
Yeah,
some
totally.
rest with
Totally.
it? That I mean, that
Yeah.
must feel
Yeah.
really different in your body compared to how you felt in previous roles.
Completely. Yeah. That is a good part to end on, as I realized that we were at
Yeah,
our
yeah. I was just
yeah.
thinking, like, for
Yeah.
people that maybe are in jobs or sectors, even questioning whether they want to stay in this sector, I just sort of think that you've made a kind of transformation and a change, and it's just interesting to kind of go on that journey with you, and how you might be feeling having come out the other side.
Yeah. It's like, I think, there's nothing wrong with making money. I think money is important as an enabler and as a way of demonstrating value. I think we just have, um, in the way that we direct our organizations, sometimes an overt obsession with it that means that we're thinking short term a lot and not really thinking about where we're going as a society or as a civilization or as a global kind of community. Um, and so, yeah, stepping out of a space where that is, we still need to make enough money to survive in the world in the context that we live, but where that's not the overarching goal, and where time can be given to rest or community, or, at the moment we're just investing a bit more time into a project that we've already been paid for, because actually we want to make it really good, and like want to kind of make sure that the value is delivered in what we want to do. That
Yeah, I
feels
mean,
like the right thing.
there has to be more to life, doesn't there? And yeah, I think, given these times, it's a good note to end on and reflect on. So, thank you. Thanks for sharing your journey, and just kind of kicking the breeze a bit, and thinking about, what the strange industry we've found ourselves in, um, and how it works. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming on. It's been really good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. It's been a lovely conversation.
Awesome. Cheers. Thank you.
Okay.